Madame la Ministre.
Madam Minister, Secretaries of State, Director, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's a pleasure to have you here for the fourth edition of our Franco-German Energy Forum. Patrice, good morning. Patrice Geoffrin, who is a professor of economics at Paris-Dauphine University, and he'll be with me this morning. Nathalie Croiset, and we'll be running today's show. Today is run by the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, the French Ministry for the Ecological Transition, the Federal German Ministry for Energy, and the Federal German Ministry for the Economy and Energy as well. So we are all here today for the first time ever at the French Ministry for the Ecological Transition. Welcome to each and every one of you. And this is the second time we'll be meeting in a hybrid format, so it's a pleasure for me to have all of those of you who are joining us online today. So welcome. Today we're talking about financing the energy transition in Europe. So we'll be looking at the future system of energy in Europe and what this transition would look like. So how can we fairly spread the cost of that energy, and how can we also move towards further synergy between markets and also ensure energy security through policy. So we are broadcasting live from Paris, and there will be a second broadcast of the Franco-German dialogue during the lunch break, and that will be coming to us live from Berlin. So we will be back at 11:30 for our round table. We have Andreas Schweist, who is the State Secretary, German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, and Barbara Pompili, French Minister for the Ecological Transition, amongst many others. Thank you very much, Madam Minister, Secretaries of State. Meine Damen und Herren, guten Morgen. So I will be sticking to French this morning. I just wanted to say a few words in German for everyone. So I want to welcome you all. This is a long-standing partnership that is based on research and our Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition. And we focus on the energy transition at Franco-German and European level. And given the particular context, Natalie, you started mentioning it just a few seconds ago, the COP26 just came to an end, and we have been thinking about what we as Europeans can do as part of the Fit for 55 program, dealing with unexpected tension on the market. And when we look at European websites, we can see that there's a lot that can be done. So we'll be talking about all these sorts of topics throughout today. So, Madam Minister, if you could please come to the stage for a few quick words to introduce today's session. Thank you very much. State Secretaries, the Director of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, the Director for the International Energy Agency. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to each and every one of you. Herzlich willkommen. This is the fourth edition of our Franco-German Energy Forum, and for the first time we're meeting here in France. It's such a pleasure to have you all here at the Ministry for the Ecological Transition. Today is a time where we will get to speak and share points of view, because when we talk about the energy transition, it's not just a technical topic, it's a fundamental choice for societies which is built around the ecological transition as a whole. So today we'll be talking about renewables, costs, markets, flexibility, but more than that as well. The topics that we'll be discussing today within this forum, these are the keys to ensuring that the energy transition will be a success, not just for us in each country, but also at a European level, and generally speaking, to fight against climate change and the collapse of the biodiversity, and also a way of reducing our carbon footprint. This forum is essential because it's an opportunity for us to sit down together and think about our own energy policies in open dialogue, a trust-based dialogue between France, Germany, and more generally within the European Union. Energy, historically speaking, is at the heart of the European project, ever since the creation of the ECSC in 1951 with the common market for coal and steel. And today's event reminds us today just how important it is to look back and see all that we have done at a European level when it comes to dealing with energy and more. Today is such an important day in terms of cooperation between France and Germany when it comes to energy, because we recently bolstered that cooperation with the Aachen Treaty signed back in 2019, which was so important for both our nations. I would like to start by thanking all those who have been working to prepare and organize today's event. My thoughts go out, obviously, to the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, which is the linchpin of today's event. And I would also like to make special mention of all of the work done by the federal ministries for the economy, energy, the Federal Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and also my teams here at the Ministry for the Ecological Transition. I would also like to thank all those people who kindly accepted our invitation to speak today to share with us all of their knowledge and experience. When talking about funding the energy transition in Europe is of fundamental importance, and it is such a current topic. I would like to take a few moments to just lay the backdrop, to talk about the issues at stake behind today's event. First and foremost, the climate emergency that we are all aware of and that affects us all, both at a European and international scale. Must we remind it once again, the latest report from the IPCC says that climate change affects everyone across the Earth. Global warming is currently at 1.1 degrees Celsius, which is the highest level ever. Moreover, the International Energy Agency stated in its annual report published last month that when it comes to clean energies, they aren't progressing fast enough to sustainably drop global emissions to reach net zero. A second point of backdrop is the COP26, which just came to a head. While we weren't able to come to sound fruition on all negotiating points, a number of major progress points have been made when it comes to energy. For example, we have the global carbon market, which is a historic milestone. But it's the commitment of 30 states, including France and Germany, to put an end to public subsidies of fossil fuels internationally starting in 2022. Also a commitment made by some 100 countries to reduce their methane emissions, which are extremely harmful, by 30% by 2030. The COP26 was also an opportunity to sign off an important agreement with South Africa with 8 billion euros to support South Africa as it phases out coal. And I'm so happy to see that France signed off that agreement with Germany and the European Union. So this shows the logic behind the shared visions of France, Germany, and Europe when it comes to climate diplomacy. Together, in terms of energy, everything that was done at 26 in Glasgow will have major impact on our policies, our energy and climate policies. And third, a third point I would like to touch upon is the increase in our energy and climate ambitions, both nationally and at a European level, which show us that the energy transition is a fundamental policy issue. As you know, we have the new European targets as part of the Union's climate law, which says that we need to reduce greenhouse gases by 55% at least by 2030, and we need to reach net zero by 2050 within the Union. So these targets will be broken down in a number of laws, Fit for 55, and they will be implemented and transposed into national level law. So this decade is a pivotal decade. Every day counts because the decisions that we make now will help us reach our objectives. There's only one way of getting it. We have to implement these different commitments through concrete, believable, realistic plans. So with this forum will help us look at all of the benefits of long-term energy transition. Now, it is not only essential, but it's also a great source of opportunity. It's a historical moment for us to be able to strengthen our own energy independence by moving away from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels still make up a large portion of energy consumption. In France, 2/3 of that is made up by fossil fuels, despite the fact that nearly most of our production is carbon-free. And yet, while we have petrol, oil, and gas, we still use those energies, which makes us dependent on third-party countries. So an increase in oil and gas prices has an impact directly on European markets. So when it comes to import, we need to move away from imports and look more towards local production of carbon-free energy. So while fossil fuels continue to increase in terms of price, the cost of renewable energies, they continue to drop. Renewables are now more competitive, and we need to grow them. We need to bring them more structure through European renewables energies because they can create jobs and boost wealth in our countries. We could also need to focus on nuclear energy as a part of pushing this transition forward, because now it is a perfect opportunity for us as French specialists to be able to implement more nuclear technology. So the energy transition, it's also an opportunity for economic benefit through carbon-free industries and bringing industries back to our countries. So while energy production is still actually quite low in terms of emissions, we can still bring back industry to our countries, and that will help reduce our overall footprint as Europeans by having low carbon, well-managed prices on electricity. It's a matter of competitiveness for companies, but also sovereignty and independence for us as Europeans. Another final point which is taking on more importance, as we've seen the current energy price crisis, is this notion of acceptability, of the acceptability of the ecological transition. I believe that if this ecological transition is not one of solidarity and inclusion, it will not happen at all. So we need to convince and involve everyone, all citizens, in this movement. So our energy policies, be it national or European, they need to play a fundamental role because we need to help use those energy policies to try to keep a check on energy prices, to break down that all too easy link that people make between volatile prices, high prices, and carbon-free energy. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say there are three words for today: responsibility, solidarity, ambition. These are values that bring us together today, that bring us together as German, French, as Europeans. Our energy policy in France and Germany will have fundamental impact on the future of our societies and economies. If we can find ways to coordinate action even more in terms of energy and climate policies of our two countries, and even Europe, then we will all come out of that much stronger. So it is essential for the ecological transition, but also for sovereignty in industry. Today, I will speak later at a roundtable when we're talking about the means that we need to put in place to be able to reach our energy objectives and climate objectives at a European level, and I will also outline what we're going to do within our government, but also as part of the European bundle Fit for 55. I am looking forward to today's debate, and now I will hand over to my German colleagues. It was such a pleasure to meet them this morning, and I thank you all. Dankeschön, and I wish you all the best for this morning. Madam Minister, thank you very much for those introductory remarks. So thank you very much for outlining the importance of the topic for today. I'll now hand over to Mr. Berger, who is State Secretary for Foreign Affairs at the German Federal Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and he's currently in Berlin. So over to you. Thank you very much, Madam Minister. Thank you, Mr. Rösner, Mr. Biron, Andreas Feicht, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Paris. It's such a pleasure for me to be here to open up today's Franco-German Energy Forum. Today is marked by quite a unique anniversary. For some 15 years now, the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition has been helping to deepen our energy cooperation. The OFAT, Mr. Rosner, brings together companies to try and understand and help us drive forward the energy transition in both of our countries. So congratulations. I wish you all a fantastic anniversary. And it is a fantastic opportunity today to continue discussion. But while your contribution is important, we still have a lot of work to do. To give you an example, the International Energy Agency reported in its World Energy Outlook that the global economic recovery after the COVID pandemic was by no means a green recovery. On the contrary, we're back to a fossil fuel status quo. Demand for oil and gas has increased massively. And in 2021, we expect to see the second largest ever measured increase in CO2 emissions. And while governments' recovery packages throughout Europe are a huge opportunity for the energy transition, when we look at the worldwide scale, only 1/3 of the investments that are needed have been put in motion. And these are investments that are so desperately needed for sustainable conversion of our energy systems. So the COP26 conference has given us a bleak outlook, and so it comes from before the COP26. And thanks to the ambitious measures decided there, it may still be possible to curb global warming more and advance the energy transition. I'm thinking, for example, of the new partnership with South Africa, Germany, France, the European Union, the United States, and the UK. Over the coming 5 years, they will put 8.5 billion euros on the table to support South Africa as it develops clean technologies, in particular green hydrogen. If it works, it will serve as a fantastic example for developing countries, as a way for those countries to phase out of coal and move towards other forms of energy. Another main topic is the end of fossil fuel subsidies, increase in clean energy production, more energy efficiency, lowering of methane emissions, also the promotion of clean innovations and clean infrastructure. And all of that in spite of a volatile international environment. We need to take into account the needs of citizens more. Today I would like to touch on 2 points. First, I would like to look at the current example of the energy price debate to say, should we trust in the self-regulating power of the market? If we look at European gas prices, it reflects the general dynamic of the global gas market, which is due to a combination of a strong recovery in demand from Asia and tighter than expected supply side, and also weather-related factors such as the coming winter here in Europe. According to the federal government in Germany, the market wasn't failing, and there is no evidence to show that the market is even manipulated. We often say that there are certain constraints, but in Germany we haven't seen that there is a shortage of gas, nor have we been able to say that Russia isn't upholding its side of their agreements. Since mid-November, the levels of gas supplies are where they are meant to be. At the same time, this does not preclude the possibility for different countries in the short term, in light of the social impact of increasing energy prices, to take national measures. But in the long term, I would dare say that the solution lies in renewable energies, massive expansion of renewable energies. Not only do we need to find the cheapest form of energy production through these energies, but they can also help cushion price shocks. Incidentally, this is the view shared internationally. Europe needs access to commodities and energy internationally, and for example, there was the recent change for the hydrogen market, because we can't produce enough hydrogen in Europe to be able to reach our climate targets. And also at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, we don't want to forget the power play at stake in the world when it comes to energy. There will be a number of people who will win, but there will also be those who will lose out. When it comes to renewable energies, they can help diffuse previous conflicts due to fossil fuels, for example. They are on this downward trend. I'm thinking of the Middle East, the Gulf states, because renewable energies, generally speaking, are available anywhere in the world. So the global energy transition is having an impact on oil and gas export nations. So that's why the German federal government is working on these two aspects of international energy cooperation. We want to ensure access to affordable, safe, sustainable energy, and we also want to play our role when it comes to protecting further upheaval around the world. And we want to have a safer world with more decentralized energy production. I wish you all a fruitful debate, again, one based on Franco-German friendship. We will follow debates today with much interest, and we wish all the best for France as in the upcoming presidency of the EU.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for opening up this international perspective on the questions of safe supply, security of supply, and how we can assure this in a decarbonated future. I would like to call on your colleague, Andreas Fecht, State Secretary at the German Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Madam Minister, dear State Secretary, Mr. Rosner, dear Fatih Birol. Usually in our ministry, we look a bit jealously at our colleagues at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs because diplomats are able to travel around the world and participate in events. And today, it's a bit opposite because I have the opportunity to be here in Paris, and I'm looking forward to this debate and exchange with you, but it's a special pleasure to be here in France today. Madam Minister, you said yourself that today we are at an important crossroads, a point of decision-making that will be important for us as Europeans, but also for the world as a whole. Yourself, Fatih Birol, and our colleagues in Germany just experienced the debates in Glasgow, and we saw how important that was. How will we manage the energy transition, and how will we set it up on a planetary scale? With regard to CO2 in the atmosphere, industrialized countries are mostly responsible for gas emissions. But for new emissions, we also have to look at the 6 billion people who are living in the developing world. For that, we need international agreements. We need international mechanisms that will enable us to act on a level playing field. In Germany, we seek to reduce our greenhouse gases in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. But that's not only a question of how we will transform our energy system. We also have to make decisions on investment, consumption, and mobility on all scales. So it is a deep transformation of the whole of society that will be required. And this is taking place at a time where new markets are emerging, new countries around the world are taking on a more competitive role in international markets. So we need to think about how our European industries will be given the capacity to face the challenges of this new world. We are focusing on mobilizing private capital and creating a regulatory framework and an economic and political framework that will provide the best conditions for the transition of our industries and our economy. Over the last 10 years, we have progressively transformed our electric system, but that's only part of the task that is ahead of us. We have to integrate new sources of energy that can go beyond what electrification has done, in particular decarbonization. In Germany, we also need green electrons and green molecules. And that is why we have defined our strategy on hydrogen in particular with 18 federal measures. And I'm very proud to say that we have been able to draft these 18 measures and also to implement them. An important task awaits us in Europe, and I'm looking forward to the French presidency of the EU Council. We need to implement the Fit for 55 package. This is really central. The EU will provide a central framework that will give security to all economic stakeholders and clearly define the rules of the game. The hydrogen strategy, the development of renewables, and energy efficiency will all be central themes of the presidency. But the mobilization of private funds is also important in order to guarantee the necessary investments. For this, we need a regulatory framework that is clear, and we need to know what the EU's position is in this area. We hope that we will be able to reach a good consensus quickly. The EU has a reputation of sometimes being too bureaucratic. I have participated in different types of negotiations that are sometimes very technical in nature. But I think that what's important at the end of the day is that we do manage to create a clear regulatory framework. In Germany, we are turning to the development of renewable energies, as our colleague Mr. Berger said, but we're also looking for international cooperation. I talked about the strategy for hydrogen development, with 7 billion to develop our hydrogen-based economy, with capacity objectives set for up to 2030 and 2050. In this regard, we are cooperating in particular with our colleagues in France in the context of significant projects of common European interest. We are creating a transverse value chain, in particular with regard to transport and use in industry and heating networks. But we also have a very international aspect to this work, as I already said, and it's not enough to target a national production. We must look to Europe for cooperation and even beyond Europe. This is why we have many agreements on hydrogen. And we're working in partnership with the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We're working with Ukraine in particular, with the United Arab Emirates. And I remain convinced that we must not only preserve our security and our sovereignty with regard to energy, but it is in our interests to ensure that around the world everyone has the technology that will enable reduction of greenhouse gases. Thank you very much, and I look forward to further exchanges during the day. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for talking about this transition and the fact that you're not only focusing on electricity. Several times, since this morning has begun, we've heard about hydrogen, which is an important stake for industry and transport. And now I'd like to hear from the director of the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, the OFAT. Sven Rosnell, if you could give us a few words of conclusion. We've heard quite a bit about the OFAT since this morning, and we've talked about your work on coordinating policies and also for the work supported by researchers. Madam Minister, Secretary of State Feist and Berger, Mr. Executive Director, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends. Hello, and welcome on behalf of the OFAT to the 4th Franco-German Energy Forum on funding the energy transition in Europe. It is for us a great honor to be one of the co-organizers today, together with the Ministry for the Ecological Transition, the Federal Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Federal Ministry of Economy and Energy. We hope that you and your families are well. We meet here today, just a few days after the end of the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow. I've often thought about the COP21 in 2015. I think at that time we were all very enthusiastic. One of the big results of COP21 was that it sent a signal that the international community was ready to cooperate to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And we understand now that things are progressing, certainly, but also that these objectives of the Paris Agreement are going to be difficult to achieve. The universal challenge with agreements, and Mr. Secretary Feist has just reminded us of this, is that the more stakeholders there are, then the higher the stakes are, and the less obvious it is to find a formula that is compatible with everyone's needs. The more opinions there are, the more difficult it is to find common ground and concrete results. But reaching this compromise for the climate is essential if we want to obtain concerted action, and the first step towards a compromise is a better understanding of the different positions through dialogue. The Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition, has been working for 15 years now to foster this dialogue, and we would like to take this opportunity to warmly thank the MTE, the BMWi, and our 260 members for their support and participation in our work. Ladies and gentlemen, let's now look closer at the subject of our conference, the financing of the energy transition. Oscar Wilde said, "A cynical person is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing." If we can now estimate the cost of the fight against global warming and the energy transition, how can we determine its value? Who can tell us today what we would be prepared to give in 30 years' time to be able to return to this moment last week in Glasgow, to the negotiating table? But we mustn't be cynical. There are also encouraging signs. France and Germany and the European Union have set ambitious objectives for the decarbonization of our societies up until 2050, as well as for its social and economic framework. Today, we are gathered to discuss the financing of this integrated energy transition with political representatives, administrations, researchers, industrialists, project leaders, financiers, and civil society, to dialogue and see how we can turn our goals into realities, taking positions into account and not excluding anyone. We thus hope to make a constructive contribution to the fight against global warming and to an efficient and fair energy transition for all. Finally, I'd like to thank you all of you who've made this conference possible despite the difficult circumstances, and I'd like to thank all of the people who have come here to hear the conference, whether in person or at a screen. And I wish you all much success, and thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Sven. And I'd like to thank the whole team from the Franco-German office for the energy transition, which was really a cornerstone in creating today's conference. You will be able to ask questions through the chat, and insofar as possible, we will be giving those questions to our speakers. The presentations will be available in 1 week on the OFAT site. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Birol to the stage. I won't spend too much time introducing him. He is the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. This year they made 2 decisive contributions with the Net Zero report and the World Energy Outlook in 2020 that was published before the COP and informed the debates there, and was also much discussed at the university as well. Thank you very much.
Minister Pompili, Secretary Fahrt. So eine nette Überraschung, Sie wieder hier zu sehen, Herr Staatssekretär. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to see all of you here. En fait, c'est une très belle coïncidence. J'étais hier à Berlin avec Monsieur Veit et Monsieur Berger.
It's a coincidence because I was here with Mrs. Feiter and Berger here in Paris not too long ago. And it's such a pleasure to be able to be here today at this forum with 2 great countries of our agency.
This forum is taking place at a very important time. We always say this, but this is really true, for 3 reasons. It is just after Glasgow. It is just before France going to preside the EU, and it is just before Germany is going to preside the G7. So 3 important reasons. And here I would like to share a few thoughts, first on Glasgow, and then also what Germany and France, 2 main drivers of the global clean energy transition, can do during the presidencies. Now, for Glasgow, both Mr. Veit and Madam Minister talk a few outcomes from Glasgow, but I would like to mention 2 things. First, a general. I do not agree, let me start this way. I do not agree to see Glasgow as a failure and to see it as a meeting, as an international summit which didn't come out without significant success stories. I don't agree with that, whoever says that. There are many important outcomes, positive outcomes. Of course, one would, especially we at the IEA, would like to see much clearer outcomes in many fronts, but this is an international negotiation, so we have to be careful on that. I would like to focus on the following. I was discussing with Madam Minister, so I thought I should bring shed some light on that. And this is one of the outcomes of, in my view, Glasgow. The process through Glasgow and in Glasgow, which is the following. More than 90% today, as of today, more than 90% of the global economy is today covered by net zero commitments. It is huge. When you think about this, only a year ago, it started with Europe. In fact, almost everything as far as climate change is concerned, has started with the Europe's leadership here. Now, we have, at the IEA, we have calculated if those pledges to be fully implemented, what does it mean? It means, again, I underline, and I underline with red, if fully implemented, the world temperature increase would be limited to 1.8 degrees Celsius. I think this is an important political success story of Glasgow. Having said that, full implementation is the critical word, the magic word here. Especially within the next 10 years, what will happen? And here, I would like to highlight two things when we talk about the implementation and next 10 years. And our chairman mentioned the World Energy Outlook we have highlighted there. The first one is massive expansion of renewable energies, especially in the power sector, decarbonization power sector. Many of us have mentioned, her fight several times mentioned, it is one of the cheapest source of power generation. When you look at the world, dear colleagues, last year, more than 90% of all the power plants built in the world were renewables. Only 10% coal plus gas plus nuclear, 10%, 90% renewables. So therefore, this is one job, and the second one is many times forgotten, the energy efficiency improvement. So these two are, in my view, the two pillars of the implementation in the next 10 years, so that 1.8 degree that the country's ambitions come there are seeing the light of the day. Again, I would caution everybody to stamp Glasgow as a failure. There are good elements. Madam Minister mentioned first methane. In my view, one of the important outcomes was a pledge on methane, and as such, it was another important outcome. Now, coming from here, the presidency of France and Germany. But before that, one should put something clear, and I say in all of my speeches wherever I go. Today, it is good to see so many governments, so many countries are playing a positive role to address climate change, or at least they say they are going to play a positive role. But one shouldn't forget this. When nobody was around, it was Europe who was pushing the climate change agenda. The camp to fight against climate change was not so crowded only a few years ago. It was Europe, and within Europe, France and Germany, they definitely had the leadership here. And we have therefore all the reasons to expect more from the two countries in their during their presidency. Now, we can expect a lot, but I would, for both countries, I would like to suggest two things. For Germany, at the IEA, we are a data-driven organization. When I look at that data, what is the most important challenge in terms of reaching our climate goals? Many, many of them, but one of them, if I had to pick up one, it is by far coal. Coal in Europe, coal in North America, and especially coal in Asia. So therefore, Germany's leadership to phase out coal in a timely manner so that Germany itself can set an example to other countries. And my hope, I mentioned this in Berlin to different colleagues I met, Germany's good coordination with the G20 president, Indonesia, G7, G20 presidency, Indonesia, to give a boost to coal phase out in a quick manner would be much appreciated. So this is one of the wish list one may have to give Germany's G7 presidency, I would like to highlight. Second, for France, France is also going through elections very soon. And in France, I would like to see that while there is a big room to push renewables stronger, I had several discussions with Madam Minister, especially her ambitions for several renewables, including offshore wind, but also now putting in line with the President Macron's recent statements, putting nuclear together with renewables and putting on the table a new model there, based on the study that the RTE has put together, I should say, many of you may not know that the International Energy Agency provided a substantial input for that study, how renewables and nuclear can go hand in hand in the current French power mix, and how it can be this or that way be a source of inspiration for the rest of Europe would be important. Another point for the French presidency, and this is also for all of us, all the Europeans. Dear colleagues, when I look at the history of the renewables, I think Europe needs to learn one important lesson, which is the lesson of solar. Many of the colleagues would remember, I am sure Jean-Michel, who knows almost everything about the European energy system, would remember, the solar, beginning of the infancy time of solar, it was European countries who put a lot of subsidy from their taxpayers for the solar subsidies, making solar a bit of the part of the market to bring the solar costs down. But now, after a while, Europe dropped the ball, and some other countries have the leadership of solar, and today, 7 out of 10 solar panels are produced in another country around the world. Therefore, now Europe has a leadership, an important leadership in 2 emerging technology areas. And I really hope that Europe now learn from the solar experience, and both in terms of the hydrogen and in terms of batteries, started the race in front of the others in many respects, and finishes the race also in front of the others, not drops the ball in the middle. So this is my suggestion to France in terms of cementing the fundamentals of Europe being a leader in the clean energy technologies next chapter. I would like to finish by saying that when we look at the IEA in our World Energy Outlook and elsewhere, I see one very clear picture. a new global energy economy is emerging. And Europe, in my view, with all its experiences, skills, and also industry, should be a leader in this next chapter of global energy economy and next chapter of the global economy in general. And here, if not Germany and France, who could lead to Europe to be a leader in the next chapter of the global energy system, and as such, helping the world to reach its energy and climate goals. I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Birol.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol.
Quelques questions.
We have time for a few questions.
Merci tout d'abord pour avoir fait des
First of all, thank you very much for being so precise in your recommendations to Germany and France, and not just opening up it on a general perspective on Europe, and for talking about the history and the future of our role as leaders. All of this is in a very volatile price context, and in the World Energy Outlook, you talked about why oil and gas investments are falling off and low-carbon investments are rising. This is the decade of great acceleration, which will likely be a volatile period. So how can we remain a constant leader in a chaotic period?
Thank you very much for reading the World Energy Outlook so carefully and understand all the messages. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. So, dear colleagues, this is an issue very important. We are going through a very volatile market situation here. As our chairman said, the European gas prices today, once again, we have seen a major increase. Electricity prices and oil prices are also high. Now, one of the, in my view, shadows on Glasgow was the following. Some people tried to portray that these high energy prices are the first crisis of clean energy transition, which is completely wrong, but completely wrong. It has nothing to do with the clean energy being too much pushed so that we have high energy prices today. It is maybe if there is a link with clean energy, it is perhaps too little clean energy was there so that we have high energy prices. Why we have high natural gas prices? Because the demand is very, very extremely high that we have never seen as a result of the unsustainable, as State Secretary Fight mentioned, an unsustainable economic recovery we see. And the second, on the supply side, there is enough gas. There is enough gas, but it is not coming to the customers. It is not because of lack of gas investments or lack of gas there. If today, if Russia would increase the exports to Europe, for which they have all the production and all the feeds, only by 15%, they can easily do it, the prices will come down. Just remember, please remember, when the Russia said they are going to increase the exports to Europe, which didn't take place yet. But even after that statement, price collapsed significantly, went down significantly. So don't look for the problem there where it is not. And nobody should dare to put the clean energy as a victim or as the option which created this problem, high energy prices problem. The solution for Europe, in my view, solution goes two ways. One, continue to keep an eye on the energy security, make sure that the partners provide enough energy if they want to be still qualified as a reliable partner. They should provide energy to Europe in line with the understanding of being a reliable and partner with a good reputation. Otherwise, there will be a lot of questions about their reliability. This is one. Push them to bring energy there where they have. Second, and most importantly, in a stubborn way, push the clean energy. Clean energy will be a solution to our crisis, and it is definitely not the reason here. And again, Germany and France are the two engines to bring the Europe to a much more cleaner and as such safer, secure and more affordable energy system.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Difficile de vous libérer sans vous interroger,
I can't let you go without asking you about hydrogen,
depuis le début de cette
which was quite a buzzword for this morning.
on rappelait que compte tenu
The secretaries of state
européenne, il nous sera très
talked about European perspectives and how it would be difficult for us to be autonomous in decarbonated
un marché international
hydrogen, and that an international market was necessary. And I think that
sur l'hydrogène, donc
the
particulièrement intéressant
International Energy Agency has often talked about the international
se trouvera l'Europe.
cooperation perspective.
Thank you very much. Yes, hydrogen is a key issue for the IEA. In fact, during the G20 presence of Japan, Prime Minister Abe asked us directly, we made perhaps the landmark study on hydrogen. What is the cost? What are the technologies? Why hydrogen is important? And now I am seeing, and I have never seen in my life any energy technology, because there's always controversy on any single energy technology. But when it comes to hydrogen, everybody loves hydrogen now. It is very good news, I think. But what is the problem? There are many problems, but two of them are important. And Europe can definitely be a leader to address these two problems in terms of hydrogen going there. One of them is cost. When we talk about cost, here there are two types of costs. You know, when we talk about the green hydrogen, one is the cost of electricity, the other one is the cost of the electrolyzer, this type of, how shall I say, the machine, I should say, which is about 40% of the overall cost. Through learning by doing, we need to bring the cost of electrolyzers down. And Europe can play with the mass manufacturing. Europe can play an important role here. And in my view, the cost of electrolyzers here is today there, where solar was 10 years ago. And Europe can play a very important role in terms of manufacturing and bring the cost of electrolyzers. And the second here issue is the creating demand. We have to create demand for hydrogen. How do we create the demand? There are different ways here. Procurements of the governments, what they do, or mandates, creating mandates on a regulatory basis and providing incentives there to create demand. If we can do these two things, bring the cost of electrolyzers down and create demand, and here, in my view, there is a role for the public sector, hand in hand with the private sector. I think we can make the hydrogen sooner rather than later part of our energy mix. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I said positive things about hydrogen, but I want to put a cautionary note here. Hydrogen is one of the important solutions to go to reach our climate targets. It is not the only solution, and it will definitely provide a lot of relief in terms of finding a solution to our energy and climate goals, but it is not the only solution. I just wanted to register that thought as well.
Oui, merci beaucoup d'avoir rappelé
Thank you very much
solution, un outil parmi d'autres.
for reminding us that it is one solution among others. And I think that in your outlook, you talked about the hydrogen effect between 20 and 25 was about 6%, represented about 6% of the decarbonization by 2050. Thank you very much. It was a privilege to be able to ask you questions here today. I would like to remind those watching that you may ask questions in the chat, in particular with regard to merit order, but we'll be coming back to that later in the day. Now we will continue, first of all, with some thoughts on the long-term costs of the energy transition as well as its benefits. And I am pleased to welcome Professor Anna Créti. Anna Créti works in the office next to mine at the Paris Dauphine University, and she is also the scientific director of our climate economics chair at the university. So we will be learning about the benefits and costs and the long term of the energy transition. So thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, Patrice. I'd like to thank all of you. It's a pleasure and honor to be here talking to you today at the Ministry of the Energy Transition and at the Franco-German Office for the Energy Transition. I am neither German nor French, but I have devoted my career to this question, and it's very useful to be able to share my thoughts with you. I don't know how cynical I am, when someone mentioned cynicism earlier, but indeed, when we talk about the costs of the energy transition, there are some difficulties. And before we look into the figures, where there are a lot of zeros after the comma, I would like to underscore the fact that this is an outlook exercise. And this type of exercise, of course, contains a level of uncertainty. And the previous speakers pointed this out, but when you have to put figures on things, what does that mean when we talk about decarbonization? We talked about using hydrogen, but that's not the only solution. There are uncertainties regarding carbon capture technologies, regarding nuclear technology, and there's also political uncertainty. What will be the levers and the means that will be implemented? And so this creates uncertainty in the way that the transition will be carried out in different sectors and in business strategies as well. Nonetheless, I will try to discuss these costs, and as an economist, that's part of my job, is to talk about costs, but you have to always balance them out with the benefits. I'd like to talk about this in the context of costs and effectiveness with regard to reaching objectives. So I'd like to see what different costs might be in different perspectives, whether we're looking at public spending and incentives, for example, choices that seem to line up, in my opinion, with what we've been discussing today. But we mustn't forget questions of fairness, in particular in France. We need to see how the energy transition can be fair for everyone, in particular through carbon taxes, at least as they've been applied in the past. We'll look at the capital costs, the cost of capital, and how that is changing or not changing during the energy transition. This is a twofold point of view, focusing on France and France within Europe. So we've already heard about the Fit for 55 package with regard to EU legislation. Any directive like this one, any part of the Green Deal more generally, has to be evaluated from an economic point of view. So we try to see how much it will cost. And we look at different elements that are available to us at the time that we undertake the analysis. Now, we do know some things with regard to studies that the EU has carried out. We can target the costs of the new legislation, 38 billion euros between now and 2030, 438 billion euros between 2021 and 2030. This is a very heavy-ended hypothesis. With regard to the long-term budget, support to the green transition will be shared out among programs that are more global. 30% of the programs that have been calculated as representing 2 trillion euros between 2021 and 2027. These programs include a complete review of the multi-annual financial framework, and in current prices, another budget is 37% of the 723 billion euros that are taken up in the Recovery and Resilience Facility post-COVID. So there are some positive effects as we come out of this crisis, an increase in awareness of the importance of the energy transformation and economic transformation. In order to understand how some sectors, well, we talked a lot about energy, but there are other sectors that we have to look at closely for the future. I wanted to have a looking back rather than an outlook in this slide. And perhaps that's something that economists perhaps do better when we're looking backward than when we're trying to make predictions. Here we can see figures that regard to previous measurements from 2015, 2016, the period of the Paris Agreement, at the moment when we were setting objectives for 2020, 2030. And according to the different scenarios, these were forms where targets, in particular with regard to the share of renewables, went between 27 to 40%. These are the reference scenarios, the reference being 2016. So we were looking at 20, 30, and 40%. And you can see that the big difference comes less from energy itself, because the growth and the difference between the different scenarios and the expenses depend mostly on two strong points: what is spent by households and what is spent by the tertiary sector. This is more difficult to manage because there are behavior issues. Human behavior is quite difficult to direct and also to put target figures on. There's a major contribution to expenditure and necessary investments from transport, the transport sector. Once again, we're looking backwards here. We might think that with regard to the figures we're looking at for the future, we really have established the bottom line, the minimum that we could expect from necessary public investment. During the COP, we heard a lot about gaps, what we're missing in order to achieve our objectives. Here's a gap that we had put figures on in 2016 for 2030. You can see that already at the time the main drivers, power generation, energy networks, we haven't brought that up yet, but in order to have a working market, you have to have the necessary infrastructure, gas and electricity networks, and energy efficiency is also necessary, with a target of investments that was much higher than what had been observed historically. So, using a proportional analysis, you could see that this gap will continue to widen unless we take a closer look at investment. We can look at the French situation, for example. It's interesting to look at the amount of euros that are applied to every different type of plan or project. The cost of the energy transition at the European level between 2021 and 2030 is estimated at 11,200 billion, and this will grow yearly. And having a proportional analysis, you could say, what is the economic weight of France and Europe? And this is being based on the GDP ratio. You know, now the GDP is picking up again, so this was a linear hypothesis that had been made with a projection of growth that was probably lower than the actual level of growth we're experiencing today. And using this estimate, we arrived at 145 billion euros per year, spread out among the different sectors. So what's important when we look at these figures that need to be, of course, compared to other investment figures in industry, total French industrial investment is 400 billion euros per year. So this gives us an idea of the order of magnitude. So the question isn't just to say, oh, it's not enough. That's what people often say. But the idea is, are we mobilizing something that is comparable when we look at other areas of investment in the economy? So these figures came from are related to the national objectives of National Low Carbon Strategy. So it's actually given a range of between 43 and 62 billion euros. Once again, these are not negligible amounts. More specifically with regard to France, I look at I4C. This I4C study looks at spending on the transition in France, and this chart is interesting because you can see the shift and the increase in spending related to different decisions and different means that had been implemented in the context of the French government's legislation and the introduction of renewable energies. You can see certain important milestones with regard to fostering or encouraging investment, the introduction of important levers. For building, for example, there's a program called MaPrimeRénov' for renovating buildings to make them more energy efficient. Also, public aid for modernization and electrification of the automobile pool in France. This growth is not exponential. It's constant, but not exponential. So here we see some more figures about a different gap, which is the national investment gap. A lot of uncertainty here too. The door is open for acceleration, but when we look at different low-carbon strategy budgets, this study said, as you can see, that with the same reference scenario, 2016, 2018, growth could be between plus 15 to plus 75 billion yearly. That's the government, and that comes from the efforts and the contribution of citizens. And the minister said earlier that it is important that the transition fund be inclusive, that the transition movement be inclusive. It has to be acceptable to citizens. And I think this is something we must not only study. This is something that we do at the university. We have to anticipate as well. We have to try to understand and share information on the costs of the transition, because it is the citizens that pay directly or indirectly. And the citizens let us know what they prefer in terms of mechanisms to mitigate climate change. I always say that what we're living through is not necessarily a crisis. What we're facing really is the world of tomorrow. Energy will be expensive because it has to be expensive. And I wouldn't say it's a crisis, but perhaps it is a bit of a shock because people are not used to paying high prices for energy. But it might be an increase of 500 euros a year. Is that a big increase or a medium increase? That's where the question lies. But we have to keep these effects on citizens in mind. In Glasgow, we talked a lot about the Just Transition Fund, but we need to have the equivalent on a European level. These funds have actions that have an impact on citizens with regard to energy efficiency. Of course, that's the service sector, that's the tertiary sector and industry, but it also has to do with residential needs, with heating, air conditioning. Indeed, with climate change, people have more and more recourse to air conditioning, and also with regard to mobility. So 25% or 1/4 of what we get in terms of revenue from emissions quota markets and from fuel taxes serves to attenuate the distributive impact of the energy transition. So more than figures, we really have to think about the mechanisms themselves, the importance of redistribution of the quota markets. Today we have sectors, mostly energy and everything that has to do with the combustion engine, but there's also the building sector and transports. All of these mechanisms, the polluters pay mechanisms, are one thing, but we have to see how we can redistribute the effects to the benefit of the most vulnerable in our society. In France, we had the experience of seeing how we can reconcile the polluters pay idea with the energy transition. In the case of the carbon tax, and there will certainly be decisions coming up in the next presidential mandate, at least we hope so. We have made an estimate of the impact on citizens, and we tried to look at this at a very granular level with the available data. Maybe they're not the most up-to-date, but it does give us a good idea and some interesting results. So with regard to previous results, we looked at some specific things. You can change behaviors, but there's a limit. Even if people are aware, even if people are encouraged, there are some behaviors that will not change. So if you look at these behaviors, we tried to estimate the share of the automobile pool and heating needs, so mobility heating, in the first income decile with regard to carbon tax, and we can see that in household spending for mobility and heating, the red part is quite important, mostly for transport, and just a small share. There are some Parisians, for example, who don't own cars, and so they're not exposed to the impact of the carbon tax, but there is always heating, which remains an important share of household expense in terms of energy consumption. We've talked a lot about phase down, phase out. That's what people were saying at Glasgow with regard to fossil fuels. So what do we do beyond prohibiting or excluding certain uses? You can also make these investments more expensive. And this is the increasing role of green financing, or TRBC, where the Paris financial markets have tried to give importance to energy transition. And this is a recognized lever that brings on board the financiers, who play an important role. Banks as well, public banks and private banks will play an important role in the energy transition. Insurance and so forth, all of the financial sectors need to be invested. What can we expect from the mobilization of the financial sector? We're still waiting to have figures about the greening of the financial sector with regard to investment and spending that is required to make structural changes in the sector, the oil and gas sector. We did a survey that gave us some results. It's not exhaustive, but it's just been published, and it does show again, it's the scale that you can see, the magnitude. You have the juxtaposition between loan volume to green energy with regard to existing loans with regard to fossil fuels. We have offshore wind, which is really rising, but that's something that's necessary because offshore wind is very expensive. It is probably the most expensive intermittent energy supply source. But there are other types of energy like onshore wind and solar power that perhaps suffer from this imbalance. So this is a gap that we need to discuss. I heard someone talking about planning earlier, and indeed, we have to bring these two universes together. We can't. We have to accompany the economy as we get out of the fossil fuel economy, because it is a destabilization, and we have to move forward. So my conclusions are, when we looked at the different scales, Europe and France, we can see that there's some uncertainties, but there are also there's clarity that emerges as well. And overall, I'm actually thinking as I speak that when we see these huge numbers, we mustn't forget that we're defending something important. There are incredible investments taking place. If we could spend a little bit less to go to Mars and a little bit more to save the planet, maybe that would be a good idea. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Anna. You said that you were not completely French and not completely German, a little bit Italian, perhaps. And this gives you a special perspective on this problematic, which is at the heart of what we're talking about today, which is the idea of precarity in the energy supply sector. I know this is something that the Germans are worried about as well. So perhaps beyond your conclusion, you had something to say about tools that could protect the most vulnerable from difficulties arising from the energy transition. Well, it's true that at my university chair, this is something that we focus on quite a lot. We look at the investment needs in order to make energy supply secure to the most vulnerable. And in this regard, we have seen that current measures in place, in particular so-called energy checks, that have been available for the past few months unfortunately are insufficient, because what is really needed is building renovations, and that is not taking place at the necessary levels. We need to have some figures from the last mechanism that was used, MaPrimeRénov', to encourage building renovation, but we need to reduce the cost to make this type of work more affordable to individuals, because individuals hesitate to make these renovations and the quality standards are not always well understood, and there's a lack of information. I think today we've devoted a lot of studies to see if this type of mechanism with regard to energy performance, does that really give enough information about the quality of the building in order to encourage investment, but also to encourage citizens when they're looking at renting a space, for example, or purchasing an apartment? Do they have enough information? So we're looking at mechanisms that have not become automatic for most people, and we have to make a very important effort, not only with regard to the budget, but in regard to communication and making them better understood among citizens and adventures. Thank you, Anna. That was not a very easy task to talk only about the costs and not the benefits. I think that was not the easiest job of the day. So thank you so much, Anna. And now we'll hear from Dr. Félix Mattès.
So his job is going to be much more enjoyable. He gets to talk about the benefits of the transition. So Matthias is in charge of the OCO Institute, and Fatih Birol was saying a little earlier that this is an institute which is a data-driven institute, and that their institutes are both data-driven, and that it's quite interesting to see how they work. It's going to be good to hear more about Energiewende and the work that they have been doing of late. Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today. I'll be speaking about something other than hydrogen for a change. I had the opportunity to spend the night here in Paris. We spoke a lot about hydrogen, about nuclear power. We shared a good couple of glasses of wine as well, and it was a great opportunity now to speak about another topic today. The topic we'll be touching on is a far broader topic. Now, I won't just be speaking about the advantages or how useful the transition is. I will also try and tie this in with a few of the costs. Because ultimately, what's important is not necessarily the costs, but the redistribution effects and how that changes over time. I think this is the fundamental issue at the heart of the transition. In my presentations, I love having charts, graphs, and diagrams, and I have a few of them. In fact, I've only got one today. But I think it's a very useful diagram to show you because it helps us understand the fundamentals at play without getting bogged down in the statistics and the figures. The transition to neutrality will come at a cost. I think it is undeniable. And I think what's really exciting here is to try and understand exactly what that cost will be, how high the bill will be, but also to see the changes in usages and habits. I think it would be interesting to see how the costs are distributed across society, but as well as the benefits. And obviously, this can take into account a macroeconomic perspective, but often when we're looking at policy levels, we have to differentiate between each individual sector. So how are costs and benefits distributed within economies, within industries? And obviously, this brings up issues of markets, competitiveness, carbon leakage as well. And also, we will look at this topic with the view of seeing how it affects private households. And the real challenge is when it comes to distributing the benefits and costs of the transition. My ground notion is that that distribution is probably the true fundamental challenge of the energy transition. Maybe things will strike a balance in the future, but that will happen later on. But in the transition phase, the fundamental challenge is when it comes to distributing a fair distribution of costs and benefits. To start off the presentation, after that very brief introduction, I would like to draw your attention to a study. It's a it dates back quite a bit. It's Millions at Risk. It's a UK study, and it looked at how climate change is going to impact the world if we don't do anything to stop it, and the impact it will have on other issues such as food, water, and the impact that will have on worldwide health. And we can see the charts here. And you have the number of people who will suffer from water shortages if the temperature increases according to certain levels, and that the temperature increases what you have on the x-axis. So as I said, this study goes back a short while, and there's a certain tipping point. And once you go beyond that tipping point, water shortages will no longer affect just 100 million people, but 350 million people around the world. And it will become drastic if we reach that 2.5 degrees. So it would be somewhat naive to think that such a shock would not have an impact in terms of costs on our society. And that's why it is, for me, a fundamental notion to bear in mind when trying to estimate the cost of transition. Because to continue along the same path, if we don't do anything, would be far more costly than what we will be doing if we try and fund the transition. Because so much more collateral damage will come into effect if we don't try and stem global temperature rises. So we need to keep these figures just in mind, because they will be at the outset of fundamental change. And while, yes, this transition will cost, just going as business as usual, that too will cost. So this is something we must bear in mind when thinking about the energy transition. Moving on to this next slide. So obviously, the ecological transition and protecting the environment are fundamental trends, but there are other trends that we must keep a strong eye on. There are new forms of uncertainty when it comes to fossil fuel markets. There's also the advent of new technology. There's a lack of legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks, which also is something that we must bear in mind. And then a few other underlying trends. You have restructuring, the digital trends, which will also be a fundamental part of the overall transition. And also sector integration, integrating all of the different sectors within this transition. So this is all important when trying to weigh up the costs and benefits, and we must bear them in mind when looking at analytical work, but also in debates. So there were the few introductory remarks I wanted to make before going on to the heart of my presentation, and we must bear them in mind as I go through my presentation now. So obviously, with our forecast work, we can only forecast so far. Nothing is certain. We have forecasts going up to 2050. but that's in the coming 30 years. So we must remain modest when thinking and conservative when thinking about those forecasts. But here, when thinking about the costs and benefits, we need to look at the structural backdrop of the world, of society. We must be cautious here, because we could say that we could describe the world in the way it's structured in the future. And the way I see the future of the world is one defined by 6 fundamental characteristics. First and foremost, zero carbon. We want to have climate neutrality. But we also want to reduce pollution, reduce risk by then. This is something that is a fundamental debate in Germany at the time being, but that's not what we're going to focus on today. But the future will be one where it's zero carbon, low pollution, and low risk. Also, it will be far more distributed. For the time being, a few power plants have sufficed to give enough energy for a whole nation, but the future energy sector and the energy networks will be far more distributed. It will be one of some 20,000 individual players on the energy market in the future. So we have this is going to be the future of the energy sector, and it's going to require considerable restructuring. And for that, there needs to be a centralized coordination body to be able to coordinate all of those individual actors. Also, the future of the energy industry will be one which requires more capital. As was mentioned just previously, the running costs will drop, despite the fact that we will be living in a world that requires more capital upstream investment. Granted, we will be able to break even in the future, but nevertheless, it will require more capital investment. Ultimately, what that means is that the system will be more profitable. So this notion of operating costs is fundamental to the debate. In a climate where you have a capital-intensive industry, quite simply because such systems will greatly depend on the specific country, and unfortunately, the more distributed model will have a more negative impact on those people with less means to be able to afford such energy networks. So it will be less inclusive, and we need to bear that in mind. Also, another point is when we look at the figures in terms of investment that were shown just by my colleague just earlier, we see that the largest cost when it comes to transforming this whole industry, this whole sector, is when it comes to transforming the transport sector, when it comes to manufacturing and running vehicles in the future. So obviously this requires certain policy drivers. And there's also the notion of whether people will accept these new technologies. The ecological transition must be widely accepted throughout the society for it to be able to go ahead. So these are the 6 main points that we must bear in mind when thinking about the cost-benefit analysis. But here we have a few macro forecasts that we can look at when modeling and trying to understand these future trends. And while we have come up with this model, there are certain limits that must be brought in mind. Ultimately, we need to strike a balance between costs, operating costs, and the benefits, because we need to strike the balance to have a truly climate-neutral energy system. And we need that difference to be only around 5% in the midterm, because in the long term, or whether it's plus 10 or plus 5% in the long and midterm, that will depend greatly on the decisions that we're going to be taking now. For example, what will the cost of fossil fuels be in the future? What will be the cost of an electrolysis system be to produce hydrogen? What will the cost of an electric car be? And that requires policy now. In terms of scale, they are quite manageable. These levels are quite manageable, but it does require upfront investment, large-scale upfront investment, a few hundred billion in Germany, for example. Currently in Germany, 700 billion euros are being invested, and all they would need is just 1/7 more of that to be able to reach the necessary levels. And when we see investments being made elsewhere, we need to take this with a grain of salt. Some say that we would need to double investment in the building industry compared to current levels to be able to carry forward the energy transition. And to reach these levels, it is actually quite reasonable to think that it is possible. Now again, these upfront costs, we mustn't confuse these with overall costs. So that's almost like a top line and bottom line calculation. Because also we need to think about how dependent we'll be in the future on imports and energy imports. And they will decrease significantly, but they won't disappear because obviously you have hydrogen and other energy derivatives. So countries with significant shares of industries, they will be the best set to really carry forward a strong transition. But that transitioning towards this new world that I described a little earlier, will be full of major challenges that they will have to face. Now we could look at a bottom-up perspective, a cost-to-benefit analysis from a bottom-up way. So obviously, this will require regulations and a carbon price. Some people will be able to adapt to that quite well, quite easily, and they will have a clear advantage over others. But others will have to make long-term adaptation measures, and will come at a net cost, so it will be a net disadvantage for them. So therefore, that raises a question in terms of policy. We don't just have to create the necessary economic backdrop to drive forward this transition. You also need to find ways of supporting industry, households, who will take longer to adapt. It's not just a matter of being poor or wealthy. We need to see where are people up to when it comes to retrofitting and updating their systems. It also is a matter of, do people have access to funds? Do they have access to lower electricity prices or not? It's a matter of trying to understand who is going to benefit from these investments. So you will have some clear winners who will be at a net advantage right in the early stages of the energy transition. Another issue is when it comes to competitivity and carbon leaks, because that is where there are a few discrepancies, but those people who are well-positioned, who have access to funding, they will be able to have a very clearly and very easy startup phase. And again, in terms of policy will also have to adapt well to the new framework in which they operate. So it's about looking to the future to try and understand what form of regulatory and economic framework, what market we will have to develop for that future, what instruments and what facilities we will have to implement to be able to support those people who are struggling the most to be able to transition fast. For example, when it comes to building renovation, to have them up to standard. Maybe they can't because they are renting. What about those people who bought a car just a few years ago and who still operate on a high-emitting engine? And these are people who probably don't have the means necessarily to invest in something new in the coming 10 years. Or there are some people who quite simply don't have the money at all. Because there are some people in society who are quite simply too poor to be able to save money. So they can't plan financially for the future, and they can't rely on their savings. And I could give you an example of a country, Nigeria. Nigeria is in quite a challenging geographic situation, which means that it has little room for maneuvering in order to push it forward its own transition. Currently, energy is produced at 55 cents, euro cents on average. So we could ask the question, why produce it at 55 cents when they could invest in solar energy, which would make perfect sense given the local climate? And the answer is because simply those businesses in place, they aren't putting up in place the upfront investments that they should do. So for these countries or for those people in society who are too poor to be able to save money to invest, they're going to be hard hit. Therefore, we need to have offsetting measures to support these people in a very targeted way, to help them, to help share the burden. So these offsetting measures, be it in terms of the economy or societal benefits, they are absolutely essential. And even if we just look at it from an economic point of view, it is essential. And obviously we need a strong regulation sector, and we need that regulation to be adapted to the future of the economy that we want to have. And it's unavoidable. Finally, when looking at certain externalities and the climate, we mustn't, that's obviously important, but there are other points that we mustn't forget. Air pollution, local air pollution, health, public health, and also, again, the other notion of redistribution. It is still fundamental. Because ultimately, here we have people living in streets or people living on the street side, on major thoroughfares where it's highly polluted. These aren't the most wealthy people around. So there, again, I'm sure that you've seen it in Berlin or here in Paris, these cities where living quality is quite high. But yet, there are still issues of air pollution and public health. So that brings us to this notion of livable cities. And also, there's another notion of having competitive businesses, and we mustn't lose sight of it. I've been thinking about this for some time now when it comes to emissions quota, and whether we'd have a carbon emissions market. It could be, I went from being a public enemy to public friend when it comes to hydrogen, because the steel industry said that they would only be competitive if the ecological transition doesn't go ahead, because when it comes to steel, we have already lost out against China. So really, there is no other way forward aside from moving towards other technologies to be able to boost our competitiveness in the future. But to be able to do so, as I was saying, we must take into account the notions of redistribution. For example, we need to take into take into account notions of land availability, land use, transport, public transport, in particular rail, and the list goes on. So this is really just I wanted to say, to add my 2 cents to the debate. Really, I think what is so fundamental is the ability to adapt, the ability to differentiate between each industry and each sector, and especially adapting that by looking at the situation at the outset and where we want to end up. And something I learned from France is that we must talk about offsetting, but we must talk about fair offsetting, because it is such a fundamental part that we need to talk about, and I will be quite excited. I was quite excited to be invited here today. It's a great pleasure. But maybe I missed the point with my presentation. Because I didn't speak just about benefits, I spoke about costs as well. No, it was perfect. I have a question for you. And a lot of the questions talk about the needs of human capital, training, and the like. To what extent are those professionals working in the automotive sector or more traditional industries, those people are going to be most hard hit by the energy transition? How can they use their skills in renewable energies or other industries, other low-carbon industries? Well, these are jobs, and for these specific jobs, we need to wonder how quickly can we train these people to have them up to speed for these new low-carbon jobs. I believe that the labor market is one which will have to adapt, and I'm not sure whether investment in these specific industries of the value chain are there for us to have highly qualified people. I think about some 10, 15 years ago, what we were doing back then, we were talking about how we could find qualified people to fill these jobs. And the debate is still on, so we'll have to continue training people in high school, tertiary education, also on lifelong training. And we can do that in Germany, we have to do it in Europe. The European model is something which will have to which will have to really focus on jobs and where we want to get people, which is actually quite different to the American and the Australian model. So we need to invest in that heavily. But on top of that, when it comes to creating new value chains, it's fundamental. But we also need to try and think about how we are going to drive the transition forward. Because sometimes transition follows Schumpeter's model. It's a world where the transition is hard, but we still need to train people to give them the right skills. For example, when it comes to coal, training people and giving them low carbon job skills is so essential. And if we look at the world is changing fast, but unfortunately adaptation and the way we adapt to that new world is slow. And that lack of pace is quite concerning, because we have on one side infrastructure, and at the same time, we have to try and find ways of setting up an entire value chain, not just for materials and commodities, but also in terms of skilled workers. And unfortunately, we won't be able to do it as fast as we wish to. So again, really, training is fundamental. And so we have these people working in traditional industries, and they're high qualified people, and I'm sure they'll be able to find a job, but training is still essential. It's such a pleasure for us to have you here, and if I understand correctly, you had quite a night last night talking about hydrogen, and thank you for being with us here today. For those of us joining us live, sign back in at 11:30 for the first panel discussion. We will have Barbara Pompili, we'll have Andreas Schwecht, and Mrs. Kadri Simon, who is Energy Commissioner for the European Commission. See you all then. Thank you very much.